Nicholas Bornoz of Capital Inc. I would like to welcome you to another panel session. This one is on regulation and policy, developments and the outlook. We have with us a stellar panel, top-level panel, and I will let John Imhof, partner and shareholder at Vedder, who's going to moderate the discussion, to introduce our panelists. What I would like to say to all of you is a big thank you for joining the panel and contributing to make the forum a great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm John Imhof. I'm a shareholder in the New York office of Vedder, which is an international law firm with offices in the US, London, and Singapore. I also happen to be the co-head of the Maritime team here. I am delighted to be moderating this panel on regulation and policy in the Jones Act and US flag. We have with us some very distinguished panelists, and it's an excellent opportunity to hear their views on both regulation and policy. There's a lot to discuss, but let me first introduce the panelists. With us, I'm not sure where she appears on your screen, but on my screen, she's in the top left corner. Susan Allan, Vice President and General Counsel, Corporate Secretary of Overseas Shipholding Group, OSG. Ms. Allan joined OSG in 2016. She's had a career in public and private sectors. Welcome, Susan. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself. Everybody, I think, knows OSG, but please tell us.
Thanks, John. In addition to those other titles I hold, I'm also the Director of Government Relations and Communications at OSG. OSG is a member of the American Maritime Partnership and also a founding member of the Florida Maritime Partnership. Both of those organizations focused on Jones Act companies.
Thank you, Susan. Also, please join me in welcoming Marcus Jadotte, who's with Crowley Maritime. He is Senior Vice President of Government Relations. He's had a very distinguished career in government and public affairs. Welcome, Marcus. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. Everyone, of course, knows Crowley, but go ahead.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you and the group. Also want to extend a thanks to Nicholas and his team for the invitation. Marcus Jadotte is, as he said, Vice President Government Affairs for Crowley. Crowley, as many of you may know, is a diversified transportation and logistics company based here in Jacksonville, Florida. We're also a member of AMP and the Florida Maritime Partnership. Proud to be one of the team members here at Crowley. I joined the company earlier this year. Crowley employs in excess of 4,500 American mariners, the largest employer of American mariners, and has committed more than $3 billion in American-built vessels. Again, really excited to be a part of the conversation today and happy to be a part of the maritime industry here in the U.S.
Thank you, Marcus. Also joining is Joe Misenti from who's the General Counsel and Chief Ethics Officer at TOTE. Welcome, Joe. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here. Like the others, TOTE is also a member of AMP and the Florida Maritime Partnership. In terms of my background, prior to TOTE, I held in-house positions at seafood companies in the Pacific Northwest. Before that, I was a maritime attorney in private practice, as well as earlier at the U.S. Department of Justice and in the Navy as a JAG Corps officer. I think many of you know about TOTE, but just a little bit of background. We are a Jones Act carrier with twice weekly container service between Jacksonville and San Juan and between Tacoma and Anchorage. Of particular note, we have pioneered the use of LNG in the maritime industry, introducing the first ever LNG powered container vessels in the Puerto Rican trade, operating the first ever LNG bunker barge in support of those vessels since 2018, and currently overseeing the conversion, the first ever conversion of our Alaska trade vessels to LNG power. One other thing to note, is our subsidiary company, TOTE Services, is the vessel construction manager, or VCM as it's called, for the construction of the new national security multi-mission vessels, NSMVs they're called, that are being constructed at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard for MARAD. These vessels will be owned by the federal government, but loaned to state maritime academies to train the next generation of U.S. mariners. This VSM concept is new, and it's the idea of incorporating best commercial practices in government shipbuilding. So there's a lot of interest in this in the future. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Last and certainly not least, Matt Woodruff, who's Vice President of Public and Governmental Affairs, has had a distinguished career at Kirby. Also has been a maritime lawyer in private practice. Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself. Again, I think we all know Kirby, but please do tell.
Well, as you said, I practiced maritime law representing primarily ship owners for 20 years before joining Kirby 18 years ago. Where I've been in this position, looking out for the advocacy interest of the company. Very active in the various maritime trade associations. American Maritime Partnership has been mentioned. I'm a past chairman of that organization, and very active in advocacy roles for the industry.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome to you all. Let's get right into it. I think all of you are representing Jones Act companies. For those of you who heard Charlie's very excellent presentation on Jones Act and US Flag 101, we have a general idea of what the Jones Act is. But since this is the policy and regulation panel, maybe we can talk a little bit about the policy of the Jones Act, because there are a lot of people with diverse and very strong interests in the Jones Act, but to hear a little bit about why it's there and what it does would be helpful. I think, Marcus, maybe you can start us off with that.
Thanks, Sean. I think I'd describe the reason, the purpose of the Jones Act in three categories. Certainly national security. And I think today more than ever, the need for guaranteeing and supporting American sovereignty is both front of mind and on the front pages. Homeland security, ensuring that the United States has oversight of our domestic waterways, and then finally economic security. In addition to the economic activity that all of our companies participate in, the Jones Act creates hundreds of thousands of American jobs and billions of dollars in economic activity. So across those three domains, the Jones Act remains highly relevant and a necessary policy that has been in place now as a public policy of the United States well before the Jones Act itself. Now for over 200 years, cabotage in the maritime space has been the policy of the United States.
You mentioned national security, and how is it that, I mean, it may seem obvious to us, but for those in the audience, how is it that the Jones Act supports national security? Anyone want to kind of chip in on that? Go ahead,
Sure.
Joe.
Go ahead.
Yeah, as you said, John, it's obvious to us, and clearly there are this fleet of Jones Act vessels out there that are readily available to the U.S. military in a time of need. So it creates another support mechanism in terms of sea lift capacity that's readily available to the government. You have U.S. built ships that are crewed by U.S. citizens, that capability is tremendous, rather than relying on a foreign country's vessels for surge reasons.
What about, is it not sort of a subsidy in a sense for keeping U.S. as a pool of trained merchant mariners who are citizens, plus a pool of skilled yard workers who can assist our naval forces if called upon to work on and construct naval vessels as well?
Well, I think the people part is a huge part of it, and there's no subsidy associated with that. You know, the government does not pay a dime to domestic operators for having a cadre of merchant mariners, nor does it you know, pay anything to keep American shipyards operating. If you think about the fact that we have a reserve fleet of ships that are tied up around the United States that are supposed to be ready to go to handle national defense needs, what those crews are missing, or what those ships are missing, are crews. And so the domestic maritime industry provides a cadre of people that can be mobilized. So even if the vessel they work on a daily basis may not be militarily useful, the personnel have the skills to transition to those militarily useful vessels and be ready to go. And so I think what we have as a consequence of having a strong domestic fleet is the ability to have this concept of reserve ships that aren't manned, that are ready to meet the national defense interest. Plus, as was stated, we have among the Jones Act fleet a number of militarily useful vessels that could be redirected towards national defense needs.
And you can see those, you can read about the Ready Reserve Fleet on the Maritime Administration webpage, where they're located, what they're doing. And you make a good point, I think, Matt, that it's really to provide support for those vessels as well, or mariners to operate those vessels when needed. Are there other contingency? Are there other constituencies, I should say, that have an interest in the Jones Act? Those seem to be the primary ones, I suppose.
Well, from a national security aspect, but you know, from an economic security aspect, I think we don't need to look any further than the recent supply chain issues that have really jammed up the international container market. And you hear of all the issues of cargo not getting where it needs to go. You haven't had those same problems in the domestic trades, and in particular the non-contiguous trades that are absolutely essential to put groceries on the shelves in places like Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. You know, those services have continued on without interruption and without significant change in cost as the international rates have you know, mushroomed, and we see ships lined up you know, waiting to get in. So I think part of that economic security argument that Marcus referred to is the security and the surety that our citizens in non-contiguous areas receive from reliable Jones Act service.
And I would echo that with Matt saying the kind of the security that you have, the reliability. OSG is in oil transportation, and we have mostly tankers, and now we have a situation going on with Russia and Ukraine that's going to disrupt that, and it's causing oil prices to be hugely volatile. And our ships and our industry related to oil supply in the US and the ability to transport it is reliable and there and present in this kind of reacting to these kind of crisis situations.
And I would add that another beneficiary are the remote communities that rely on the Jones Act. You know, it can't be emphasized enough that They are reliant for goods from vessels, and the Jones Act has provided that reliable, committed service. And on top of that, the substantial investments, as Marcus mentioned, into the trade, into the vessels, into the terminal facilities to provide, the best service possible to these local remote communities.
And looking at recent developments, within the last year or year and a half around the Jones Act, I can think of a few, not limited to the recent amendments to the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, extending U.S. law and including the Jones Act to renewable energy installations on the Outer Continental Shelf, resolving a long-standing ambiguity that had been there when the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act was written and subsequently amended, primarily with the intention of applying to offshore oil and gas. And the Mac Thornberry National Defense Authorization Act for 2021, very much at the back of the act was included this provision amending the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act again to make it more clear that it applies to renewable energy. The increased enforcement that we've seen in the third proviso specifically, indicating somewhat of an increased willingness by the Customs and Border Protection to enforce the Jones Act, and recent action by the Biden administration to create a separate Made in America executive order to create a separate Made in America office, one of the purposes of which, and just one of them, is to expedite requests for Jones Act waivers when in the interest of the national defense and when there are no other coastwise or Jones Act vessels available. All of this seems to indicate the current administration, at least, and the government is well behind the Jones Act. Is the Jones Act as strong as ever?
I don't think it is as strong as ever. I think it's stronger than ever. I think that this administration and this Congress, the level of support of the Jones Act is stronger than it's ever been.
Well
Susan,
said, Matt.
Yeah, and Susan, what do you say?
I was going to say there's multitude of things you listed off and summarized, John, show that is in fact the direction. We've got a very strong Jones Act support, and we've got very specific actions happening that continue to show the strength of the Jones Act and show that it's going to be enforced and implemented and as supported as much as possible for our future.
And in looking at the Made in America executive order, I think that was that was last year. At first blush, it looks as if this is bad for the Jones Act because it makes it easier, facilitates getting a waiver. But as you look at it a little bit more closely, I think the mere fact that the process for getting a waiver for the Jones Act, as difficult as it already is now somewhat centralized in the Made in America office, doesn't really actually suggest that the Jones Act is an important part of American U.S. policy. And the fact that you're getting a waiver and can get one not more easily, but there's a process for it, would suggest that the substance of the Jones Act is not at all under threat. Is that your read of it?
And John, I would actually say that the activity around the waiver process has made it, and I'll say recent history has made it actually much more difficult to get a waiver and made that more explicit. A kind of a brief and more recent history, it was relatively easy, I'll say, to get a waiver just a few years ago, and a blanket waiver, just by someone saying, I need to do something in reaction to, I'll use the situation of a hurricane as a kind of a typical place where waivers were requested. Hurricane's coming, I need a waiver of the Jones Act. without much thought about why and whether the waiver would actually be useful to solve the crisis and to solve the problems that were happening. And what was then being issued is what we call a blanket waiver. And a blanket waiver is harmful because it just basically says for whatever period of time the waiver is in place, the Jones Act doesn't apply to anything. And so people were making shipments under their waivers that had nothing to do with solving the crisis themselves.
Is that right? So in the context of Hurricane Maria in 2017, when the Jones Act was waived, I believe, under the Trump administration for the purposes of facilitating the delivery of relief supplies to Puerto Rico, which was hit pretty hard. Did that actually apply to transportation of materials, merchandise not at all related to relief efforts in Puerto Rico, or was it just limited to anybody and anyone who could deliver those relief efforts, non-US flag vessels to non-Jones Act qualified vessels to Puerto Rico?
Well, one of the pieces that was, I'll use the word missing from that equation, was whether the transportation was the issue, the maritime transportation was the issue, versus the issue really being that the ports and the infrastructure within Puerto Rico were not able to actually accept shipments and distribute them into the country. So that has been kind of identified as the focus. Really, we need to look at what's going to be the issue in the time of the crisis. Is the focus that there isn't maritime transportation available, or is it that the infrastructure where the materials need to go needs to be supported?
Okay, let me just turn really briefly before I move on to some of the other Jones Act related and US flag regulation. Some of those who would attack the Jones Act have done so under a number of different, using a number of different arguments, including, in efforts either to repeal the act or to suggest that territories that are currently subject to the act as territories subject to the coastwise laws should be excluded in much the way that Virgin Islands and American Samoa are excluded from the application of the Jones Act. And those who attack it, and I only know because I read every time there seems to be, the Jones Act seems to come into focus in connection with an emergency. There are some criticism. It's often called protectionism in another form. Increased transportation costs generally, and with the burden of those transportation costs falling mostly on territories and states who depend in large part on transportation of merchandise by sea, including Puerto Rico and Hawaii and to some extent Alaska. And why can't the Jones Act be more like the commercial aviation space? In particular, I flew a Delta flight the other day that was, it was an A320. It was obviously not a US built aircraft. Why does it have to be a US aircraft? What do you say to people who have those criticisms, and what is your response? Marcus, maybe you can give us your view.
Thanks, John. I'll begin by saying that it's not a new question, and a number of studies have been conducted around the Jones Act's impact on transportation costs, and consistently those studies have found that there is no linkage between the Jones Act trade and increased costs in the non-contiguous markets. Shipbuilding and aircraft manufacturing, pretty significant differences between the process for developing vessels and that for aircraft. And the U.S. is in a substantially different position with respect to the aviation industry than we are with vessel manufacturing. It is incredibly important that we maintain the ability, the independence to construct vessels in the United States, and the Jones Act supports that. In the absence of the Jones Act, it's likely that the subsidies that foreign governments lavish on shipbuilding in their home markets would displace manufacturing in the United States. That's the reality. It's not an academic exercise. The reality is that China and Korea, South Korea, and Japan have lavish subsidies on manufacturing ships in their home markets. The Jones Act ensures that we remain a fully capable maritime nation. And one aspect of that capability that we need in the United States is the ability to manufacture ships here, both in peacetime and certainly in time of war. That's not a capability that we would be able to stand up in weeks.
What about those critics who, and I saw this just the other day, what about the critics who say building a destroyer is very different from and requires a completely different set of skills than building a product tanker or a container ship, and that while we think we're actually serving the national defense by giving U.S. shipyards work or incentivizing work for U.S. shipyards, in fact, it's the skills are not transferable to military vessels. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Happy to start. I think there are active examples around the world where that criticism falls apart, where commercial vessels are being manufactured in the same shipyard as military vessels. And again, I would point to the China example that is front of mind for many defense policymakers at this point in time.
Switching gears a little bit, moving away from the criticisms against the Jones Act, I think all of you made good arguments as to why some of these criticisms miss the mark in terms of in terms of what the Jones Act is there to do. We turn it around a little bit more and ask the question, we've talked about how this Jones Act is stronger than ever. Thank you, Matt, for that observation. Is the other half of the Jones Act is enforcement, because it's one thing to have a policy and it's one thing to have statutes on the books to like the Jones Act. But if the Jones Act won't work unless it's sufficiently and adequately enforced, are Customs and Border Protection and the Coast Guard doing enough to enforce the Jones Act, or should more be done? Anyone want to take that one?
I think they're doing more than they've ever done in the past. There's now the Jones Act, I think they call it Division of Enforcement. They call it JADE. And that is a funded organization dedicated to not only enforcement of the Jones Act, but also I think they have an educational function where they go to the different folks who are in the field offices to explain to them what the Jones Act is, how it works, what the law is, so that it makes those field agents better able to recognize potential Jones Act issues. So I do think that while we've always had, certainly there's the law and you would expect that the government enforce it. I think we're now being more thoughtful about the enforcement and actually providing funding for the folks who are doing that enforcement.
I think that's a good observation. Thank you, Matt. Let me turn a little bit away from the Jones Act, if I may, unless someone has some further observations. I'd like to get into cargo preference and some of the voluntary programs that are apply to U.S. flag and in some cases U.S. built vessels, and see what thoughts you have on these. They include cargo preference rules, and those really have two parts. The military cargoes and U.S. agency cargoes, that's the law that it's described in our previous laws or set of laws in a previous discussion or previous presentation that require a certain amount of U.S. government cargoes to be carried on U.S. flag ships. Also want to touch a little bit on voluntary programs like the Maritime Security Program, the new Tanker Security Program, which was mentioned, and what it intends to do. Maybe Title 11, which came up as well, America's Highway Program, and if anybody had any thoughts about it, the Capital Construction Fund. But maybe I start with, let's start first with the cargo preference rules. What purpose do they serve? I mean, is it again sort of the same purpose as and policies that are behind the Jones Act? Anyone want to take that? Matt, maybe I can ask you.
Well, I think what those do, the cargo preference rules apply to international commerce, so they really have nothing to do with the Jones Act other than perhaps by analogy. But it's another way that we help ensure that we have a healthy U.S. flag fleet, in this case, the international fleet, by reserving government cargoes to U.S. flag ships. It ensures that they have the employment that they need to be available in a national emergency. And I think we've seen throughout history, there's a reason we want U.S. flag ships available, and that is, the old saying, these colors don't run. When things get tough, when there is a threat, we find that a lot of foreign flag vessels simply won't come load ammunition and take it to a war zone. And to go back to your comment about, can a shipyard build a destroyer and a merchant vessel? I want to point out that our forces deployed overseas don't get their fuel, they don't get their ammunition, they don't get their hardware from destroyers. They get them from merchant ships. And so you can have all the destroyers you want, but the real reason you have destroyers is to protect the merchant ships that are delivering the forces to the theater of conflict so that we can prosecute our national priorities. So I think that the ability to build ro-ros, tankers, container ships, and other types of merchant vessels is absolutely as vital to our national defense as is the ability to build a destroyer.
That's a good point. And that goes to something we were discussing and Marcus addressed earlier. All very good. What about the, I'm cognizant of the amount of time we have left. What about the voluntary programs like MSP and the new Tanker Security Program designed to make vessels available to the Department of Defense for the transportation of the goods and materials required by armed forces in times of need and conflict, or to serve in the case of emergencies? Susan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about MSP, and more particularly, since it applies to OSG, or could apply to OSG, the new tanker security program.
Yeah, sure. The Maritime Security Program has a lot of vessels. It does have 2 tanker ships in there that are OSG's tanker ships. We've been participating in the MSP for many years. The Tanker Security Program has been authorized by Congress, and it's just awaiting appropriations, which frankly, I believe that's going to be coming imminently to be authorized, and then that will be put into place under the Tanker Security Program. It's modeled just like the Maritime Security Program, and it would fund 10 tanker ships to be available to the national defenses. And both of those programs are subsidized. There is a stipend that participants are able to receive. And going back to the comments about the cargo preference laws, and some of the comments that Matt made, in order to keep the ships that are in these programs and TSP, the upcoming program, going, it's a combination of things that need to happen to make them economically viable. You need to have other business outside of participating in the programs on a regular basis that the cargo preference laws allow us to participate in, and give us some of that economic support so that we are operating at all times and ready to go when the ships are needed in times of crisis. We're looking forward to the Tanker Security Program being appropriated, that has $60 million that has already been tagged to go to that program.
Yep, for 10 vessels, yes?
For 10 vessels.
So, yeah, fantastic.
Hey, John, I'll give a short commentary on the visa program, which is utilized by Jones Act vessels. There's no stipend attached to that. In exchange for participating, get a preferential access to DoD cargoes. I'll note that TOTE during the Second Gulf War had several of its vessels participate in support of the Gulf War under that program. And so it's one that we've participated for some time.
Great. Yeah, the visa program is often overlooked. It's a great program, and I've seen it used before. And you know, a couple other things I just wanted to touch on since we're running low on time. Kind of outside the box topics that have come up for U.S. flag in particular. First, and it was mentioned by Administrator Leslie earlier today during her presentation. That is the new "Every Mariner Builds a Respectful Culture" requirements of the Department of Transportation, all in light of news of recent sexual assaults on board U.S. flag vessels against Merchant Marine Academy candidates. What every mariner builds a respectful culture, also called Embark. What is it, and how is the Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, looking to make shipping a safer environment for all merchant mariners? Maybe Susan, you can give us your thoughts on that.
It was initially, there's a big focus of it on the cadet program, which, as we all know, feeds our feeds and replenishes everything up the chain as we need our qualified mariners. But it will extend to benefit all of our seafarers as it's implemented. It's also been paired with legislation that's been introduced called the Improving Protections for Midshipmen Act that overall, the two programs, I believe, are going to strengthen the environment in which our mariners are working. It's going to make it safer. It's going to, it recognizes the evolution of our society issues where we want to make sure that sexual harassment is not present on our ships to anyone. So that way it'll promote the health and safety and welfare of our mariners, which are key to all of our businesses.
And if I understand it correctly, the Embark program works in that before a U.S. flag operator can employ students from the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, they have to adopt these policies, reporting, advocacy, things with
there's extra training, there's
extra training,
so that people know how to react to a situation of sexual harassment or assault. And one of the keys to it, to both these things, is accountability and trying to change the culture so that the harassment doesn't happen in the first place, because there's right now a lack of accountability in enforcing issues where people have been found to be in violation of anyone's policy or laws.
May I intervene to thank you all, John, if that's okay with you, because I think we are out of time.
Okay, well, thank you all, and thank you, Nicholas and Capital Link. It's been a good discussion. I really appreciate everyone jumping in and participating. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Matt. It's been wonderful hearing your views, and we look forward to hearing from you some more.
Absolutely, and thank you from my side as well tremendously for a great panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.